My name is Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of Social Sciences here at UC Irvine, and also direct a research institute called the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion. In that capacity, I do research on the payments industry and how the digitization of payments is impacting the lives of people around the world. And that's led me to some unusual places, like the blockchain space. And our panel today is devoted to thinking about the blockchain. And even the way that I talk about it indicates that there's quite a bit of conceptual and linguistic uncertainty around this thing. So I generally say the blockchain, right? Some people just say blockchain. I often refer to blockchain systems or blockchain-like systems. A lot of people will say blockchain technology, right? As if it's a box or something that you can point to. So it gives you a state of the flux that the field is in. And we've assembled a really terrific lineup of panelists representing different sides of, different aspects of the blockchain world. Mark Moore here is an attorney with Silicon Valley Bank, and I've known him for a number of years because of his own work in payments, and he's since become someone who is one of the experts on blockchain out there in the world and from a legal perspective. Seated to his left is Mick Bowman, principal engineer at Intel Labs, where he heads up their blockchain division. Mick and I have known each other for a number of years as well, going back to a research partnership that existed between my own department, the anthropology department, and Intel around technology and society. And then David Karpuk is from Planon Software on the far that side. I've lost track of my left and right. And we came to know each other when he and some colleagues of his were putting together a panel on the uses of the blockchain for facilities management. And to me, that was just like, wow, what could that possibly be? I have to accept this invitation to find out what it is they're talking about. Now, we know that folks in the room are going to have varying levels of understanding of what the blockchain is, what its relationship is to Bitcoin, how it's been moving sort of from, the way that I think of it is it's been moving sort of from the money space to the payment space, and now it's somewhere else in sort of the distributed ledger space, people would say, or into the zone almost of law or quasi-law-like things. Just to orient everybody, and then I'm going to hand it off to these guys to speak one after the other from their own perspective about this. Just to orient people, all that a blockchain really is a way of maintaining records of transactions. That's it. It has some interesting features that make it unique compared to other ways that humans have recorded transactions throughout the millennia. But it's really not that different from some of the objects that I've brought in for show and tell assembled behind me. And again, you will indulge me, I am an anthropologist who works on these things. It's not that different from a string of shells used in the Solomon Islands to keep track of transactions among families, which is what this is, a late 19th, early 20th century device. It's not that different from the Renaissance Italian Luca Pacioli's first ever attempt to do double entry bookkeeping. And this is a facsimile of that. You can see the ledger there. It's not that different from what started to happen mid-century in this country when we started using other things besides cash and coin to exchange value. This is an old Farrington credit card imprinter, right? Ow, I just hurt myself. And Mark, here, just give him a sense of the heft.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty substantial. What you would do with all these things is record human transactions, and then there needed to be some way of reckoning, some way of reconciling. Generally, with each of these devices, there would be some kind of central records keeper, some central authority who would be designated with the ability to say, yes, in fact, this transaction occurred, here's when it occurred, everyone will accept the authority of that person. With blockchain, you don't need that person. Essentially, you have a ledger that is distributed among a network of nodes, each of which has a copy of the whole, with no need for a central authority to verify and authorize transactions. Instead, the network itself is doing that work through a relatively complicated process that perhaps Mick can explain to us if anybody cares. But what it gives you is the ability to maintain records of transactions in a time-stamped, verifiable way that gives you one record of truth without any one truth holder or truth teller. Instead, it's the distributed consensus of the network that does that work for you. That can be pretty powerful. It also might just be a lot of hype. And I think we're going to get into that about, what do we need a blockchain for? Do we really need it? What's it good for? So with that, I think our sequence is first Mick, then Mark, then Dave, right? So Mick?
Sure. Intel asked me about 2.5 years ago to start looking at blockchain technologies and what their impact would be for our business. And we bring kind of a unique perspective in because if blockchain technologies happen, and regardless how they happen, they are good for us because they are fundamentally a transition from institutional and organizational trust to computational trust, to trust based on computation. Part of my job is representing Intel's interests on the Hyperledger Technical Steering Committee. So many of you, if you're familiar at all with kind of the things that are happening in blockchain, Hyperledger is a group that exists inside the Linux Foundation in order to investigate blockchain technologies and start to deliver enterprise-grade software to the market. And one of the things that comes out of that, and this is, I think, one of the kind of critical things as you're thinking about blockchain, is we oftentimes think of blockchain as a thing, or Bill was talking about it, the blockchain. But in fact, it's really a family of technologies, and don't lose sight of the fact that what's critical is the problem that it's solving for you, not the technology. We are very much, if you read Forbes or Wall Street Journal, we're very much in the stage right now where blockchain is the hammer and the whole world looks like the nail. And the advice that we give to most of the companies that we're talking to about blockchain is first understand what your problem is and what the problem is that you're trying to solve. This is a tool in the toolbox that is a really innovative tool, but it has its limitations and has things in situations where it's appropriate.
Great. Mark?
My name's Mark Moore. I'm with Silicon Valley Bank. I'm the Assistant General Counsel at the bank, and I will start off with 2 disclaimers. First, what I'm going to say is not the official position of the bank. By the way, I can't lend you money. The second is I am a lawyer, but I'm not here as your lawyer, if that makes sense. I came to the idea of the blockchain through Bitcoin. My last 2 decades of legal career focused on payments and how money moves through America. As Bitcoin became more and more prominent, my clientele, at the time other banks, I was outside counsel, began to ask, and I became familiar with it. I became something of a guide to them as they tried to understand what it might mean for them. Since then, as Bill has said, we've learned a lot. We no longer think of this technology as Bitcoin. We think of it as a record-keeping system. The areas where I would say the financial industry looks at this technology have to do with cost savings, a very natural way to approach any technological solution, integrity, and I suppose the way I would say it in the legal term, non-deniability, the inability of somebody to say, it didn't happen that way, we want a solid record. And also, in theory, a very much more rapid way of updating databases and keeping things straight. The concerns are that each of these is in the process of validation. I mean, Mick may have better insights into how far along we are. But I would say there are still some unanswered questions. I'm not sure they're material questions, but there are some. My focus more recently has been, or the interest that I bring to this more recently has been in defined areas. And we'll spend more time talking about this, but the kinds of utilization that we see coming out of the financial sector have to do with things that go to reduction in costs. So for example, if you can substitute an electronic database for a paper one. Financing trade is one area where there is a lot of interest because of the vast amount of paperwork that's involved. HR is another area where there is a lot of interest. It becomes in many ways, very attractive to seek to solve. This is really to reflect what you just said, Mick. To seek any issue as potentially resolvable through an electronic solution. I think that will not ultimately be true. There are cost benefits, and those have to be recognized, and that's part of the struggle. There are both dangers and benefits, and so we'll spend some time talking about that. Is that fair?
Yep. Dave.
Thank you. I come at blockchain from the perspective of, as Bill said, real estate and facility management. And I think that that is a field where there are problems to be solved where blockchain is distinctively capable. That said, I'm relatively new. I mean, the technology is relatively new, but I'm relatively new to it. I first learned about Bitcoin, like some of you, I suspect, from The Good Wife. And a couple of years ago, began reading research from the IT analyst Gartner about this thing called blockchain, which then I connected back to my lessons from The Good Wife and realized the power of the technology. And it took me a while to get my head around it. I think, one of the things that struck me, that made it interesting to me in my field, was that I actually think the use of blockchain as for Bitcoin, for Ethereum, for the cryptocurrencies is one of the least interesting uses of it. To me, the problems that I'm interested in real estate and facility management have to do with things like property records. In this country, we have a good and strong system of property records. However, it's got problems. In many parts of the rest of the world, there is no good historical system of property records, and so title transfer, purchase and sale of properties is very problematic. In this country, property records are kept at the county level, which makes a lot of sense because the records are kept relatively close to where the property is. But a property transaction involves a title search, which for the most part is still done the way it was done 100 years ago. It's a painstaking manual process. About 70% of title searches find no discrepancies, no clouds on the title, but then there's that other 30% where there may have been an owner who died without a will and had no legal heirs, and the property was sold at public auction. But an heir may come out of the woodwork, later on, who was in another state. There are liens on properties that may not show up in a simple title search. And so blockchain has the potential to provide transparency and visibility into the entire history of a property, back to a Genesis record, whenever the property was first recorded. Title search companies now do that. They keep their own huge databases of title history that are proprietary and are their own, and we pay a lot of money for the services they provide. We pay a lot of money for title insurance. If you've ever bought a house, those points that you pay are about those kinds of things. And so the transparency that blockchain potentially provides, and the security, the fact that you can't go back into history and change an earlier blockchain transaction record the way you can in a ledger book, makes blockchain extremely attractive. And it is being tested in this country. Probably the most visible pilot is in Cook County, Illinois, a place where they probably really need that kind of transparency and security. But in other parts of the world, Ghana, Kenya, Republic of Georgia, Estonia, where historically property records have not been well kept, it is also being piloted and I think has a lot of potential. Escrow is certainly another area. One of the potentials of blockchain is in what we call smart contracts. So the idea that a line in a blockchain ledger could contain computer code that automatically will take an action when certain conditions have been met, just like any program that we use. And so escrow, the transfer or the holding of funds by a third party until conditions have been met, is something, again, that we pay escrow agencies for. And the idea that that could be handled in a line of blockchain code so that the escrow funds are released when the obligations have been met is potentially cost-saving and time-saving. In both of those areas, because things are done manually today, transaction times are long. If you've ever bought or sold a piece of property, you know it can take many months. And so where there are limitations of, say, Bitcoin in the retail world, where it may take 10 minutes to validate a transaction with Bitcoin, and that's an eternity, in the world of real estate, it's a blink of an eye. So the speed with which real estate transactions could take place is another huge potential. On the facility management side, I look at things like the supply chain and all of the assets that we deal with in the operations of buildings, pieces of equipment, spare parts, disposables, all kinds of things. And the idea that blockchain used as a transactional ledger to monitor the creation and movement of assets through the supply chain is, I think, another area that in time will become very important.
Mark, please.
Yes, so if I can pick up on a comment, David, or two. I'm going to start in a slightly different place. My business is banking, involves records. All of us have probably bank accounts. Some of us use prepaid cards. The rest of us have bank accounts. Those are fundamentally records of debits and credits. The integrity of those records is critical. Likewise, the integrity of the kinds of records we're talking about here. One of the areas of the distributed ledger technology that is attractive is the ability to keep accurate and comprehensive records. There is, however, a risk there, and I just want to share it with you guys. We go through a lot of efforts to protect the integrity and the accuracy of our banking accounts. Of course, nobody would expect otherwise out of a bank. In the distributed ledger technology, there are incentives for people to break the technology. In the Bitcoin world, the incentive is to either steal or create false Bitcoin. One moderator in that world, in the Bitcoin world, is it's frankly cheaper to just mine Bitcoin than to try to break into somebody, outside of some very noted examples, Mt. Gox and some. When we start talking about using the distributed ledger technology, however, to have ownership of real property and have it recognized as the record for ownership of real property, the incentive to the bad guys becomes demonstrably higher. If they could break into a Ethereum or a DLT system and make it look as if they owned Trump Tower, they make a lot. So I bring that up because it's a good example of one of these trade-offs. In my view, in fact, maybe Mick, this might be a segue to you. In my view, it seems to me that in the short term, I don't mean the long term, but in the very short term, what we will see is distributed ledger technology taking care of what might otherwise be microtransactions, so that if there were ever anything that were going wrong, the impact would be either self-corrected or it wouldn't be all that material.
Mick.
So I find myself in an interesting position on this panel that I am both the, in some sense, the principal advocate of the technology, but also, in some ways, the biggest naysayer for it as well. That it's easy to sort of read, and like I said in Forbes about, geez, we're going to use blockchain for health records, or we're going to use blockchain for title, or we're going to use blockchain for this or for that. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is, as far as, so we've been doing this work on blockchain for about 2 years now, that it's kind of moved from Bitcoin to our thinking about blockchain. We've been looking at a variety of different usages. And still, as of today, there are basically, I'll say, 2.5 systems of record that are based on blockchain. One of them is Bitcoin, the other is Ethereum, and the other is Ripple,
Which one's the half?
Ethereum is a half because it's
it a half
little,
or is it two?
It's a little, yeah, it's now two halves. But they still don't make a whole. that is a reference to the split between Ethereum and Ethereum Classic that came out precisely because there was a misunderstanding of the contract in the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, which was a Ethereum-based crowd-funded VC. And the DAO was very explicit that the code is the contract until somebody found a loophole in it and was able to run off with about $45 million worth of funds that were out of that contract. Just to give you some idea, just the core principle of these decentralized ledgers is that we're replacing a single system that we trust because we have external recourse or because we have institutional trust, because we've hired somebody to manage and maintain that, with a bunch of systems that are running in places we don't necessarily understand. And we kind of vote on the results, right? So we do the computation in all of these places and sort of vote on the results. First thing you should observe is that by its very nature, this transition from centralized institutional trust to decentralized systems is extremely expensive, right? So imagine that every one of your database servers that you have right now is going to be replaced by, say, 17 of them. Now, the offset in the capital expenses in order to get that sort of resiliency and decentralization may be justified because you save so much in the paperwork and in the human costs that go into processing those transactions. But it's not free. Consensus and the kind of trust that exists in Bitcoin, you'll hear phrases like it uses as much electricity as Ireland does. And it's not quite, it's about half of Ireland. Every transaction, the transactions require gigawatts of power in order to do the verification. That means that every transaction that you're committing is using someplace between $3 and $4 worth of electricity right now. So these comments about microtransactions based on Bitcoin are very disconnected from the reality of what the investment is that you have to make in that. So again, sort of circling back to my comments, my earlier comments, when you look at these technologies, when you look at applying them to solve your business problems, and again, it's the business problem that comes first, not the technology. When you look at it for solving the business problems, ask you what the real problem is. Do you need the complete decentralization that something like a Bitcoin offers? If you do, it's going to cost you. And it'll cost you in a number of ways. Are there organizations that can serve as intermediaries? And so one of the things that the sort of best known methods that we're seeing right now emerging from the industry is the formation of consortiums. So for those of you who are familiar with financial systems, R3 is coordinating. I think they have about 100 banks or so that are participating now in R3.
Some that have withdrawn.
Yes, some that have withdrawn. And Santander is one that's, for example, that's going off and doing some of their own work. But the business model, R3 is very much a startup company, but the business model reflects a lot in the language that they use. So R3 does not talk about themselves as having customers. They talk about themselves as having members. They don't charge for payment of goods or services. They have subscriptions to it. So R3 as an organization is becoming a proxy for the decentralization of the trust. And when they do that, the most important observation of this is that that organization then is able to absorb the risk of moving into the new technologies, right? One of the problems with blockchain is that it's not useful until it is. There has to be a community in place for it. And the first movers tend to be the ones that incur the highest risk. So that's not conducive to creating. So with these consortiums like R3, they're absorbing that risk. It's really hard to coordinate and move forward the technology. There's been a debate going on in Bitcoin about block size literally for the last 2 years. It's a really simple change in a constant that would make a fundamental change in the protocol. And it's 2 years later, and they still can't figure out whether or not they should do this. Those consortiums provide a means of coordinating and driving consensus around features for it. So this notion of consortium is appropriate in many cases. It's not appropriate in every case. There are times when you really just need the decentralization. But as you're looking through the problems that you're trying to solve, understand that the more decentralization that you require, the cost is not going to be a linear increase in order to achieve that. So finding ways to coordinate your peers through some internal or, some representative organization might be the best way to make it happen.
I think Dave's going to jump in, then Mark, and then I have a question.
Yeah, I'm in the fortunate position of luxury, unlike Mick, that I don't have to make my living with blockchain. But one of the things that I do as a member of a technology company is to study trends in adoption of new technologies. And there's a couple of things that Mick's statements brought to mind. One is, if any of you are familiar with or subscribers to Gartner Analytics, the IT analytics, they produce what they call a hype cycle for many sectors. And that starts out with rising expectations that reach a peak of inflated expectations and then drop swiftly into a trough of disillusionment and then start to level off into sustainable practicality. And I have the feeling, and I think some of your words are indicative of it, that we've passed that peak of inflated expectations, and we're on the downslide. People are discovering that blockchain isn't the answer to every problem. Sure. and that's going to happen. Yes, there's enormous costs to blockchain, and the problems that it solves have to be selected very carefully. The other thing that came to mind as Mick was talking was an article last month in the Harvard Business Review called "The Truth About Blockchain." And the position of the authors of that article was that we make a mistake when we think of blockchain as a disruptive technology. Disruptive technologies come in quickly and replace existing technologies in the way that the iPhone came in and supplanted older mobile phone technologies, almost overnight. They consider blockchain to be more, they call it a foundational technology, and the analogy they make is to the TCP/IP Internet Protocol, which was invented, developed in the 1970s to solve a particular problem so that computers could, or users of computers could send messages to each other without hard cabling between each and every node that had to communicate. But it took upwards of 20 years for that to then become an explosive, quickly adopted technology over the web. The introduction of Mosaic and the World Wide Web and Netscape and all of those things didn't happen until the late 1990s, 20 plus years after TCP/IP was developed. And so their caution is to think of blockchain in that way. They believe that it has the potential to transform our economy, but that it will be slow because it will take time for those important use cases to develop and be developed and prove their efficacy before it becomes mainstream.
Mark in here, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
Yeah, I'll be brief. There are kind of two comments I want to make. One is picking up on a point Mick was making. There are different ways of trying to establish the rules that govern any given environment. One is kind of cooperative, collaborative. I think Bitcoin is more or less that. It's built into the process. It was baked in. The other is a consortium, where you have a kind of a rule-making body. And the third way is where I come from, which is the government tells us what we have to do. Or it establishes, and I should be less cynical about it, it establishes defaults that are then something that can be relied upon by the general citizenry. We have, in the current environment, some efforts to give guidance on what might be possible uses for distributed ledger technology. And I'll use Delaware as an example. Within the last 2 weeks, Delaware has begun to introduce, or has introduced a bill that would allow DLT to substitute for record keeping as to the list of shareholders in a corporation. Every corporation under Delaware law, which is a focus for virtually all of the major corporations in America, has to keep a record of who its shareholders are. One way to do that and to not have it be an obligation at the corporate level is to use a distributed ledger technology so that as shares are bought and sold, the mechanism will automatically update. I think conceptually a big breakthrough. Mick, I'll use your phrase. We were talking about it, and what it meant to me was official validation of the immutability, as it were, of the blockchain. We now have a state government saying this kind of works, or at least as far as we can see it, which is a big step forward. I think we'll see more and more of that kind of development as we move forward.
Great.
Okay, so there was just one thing.
Yeah.
I think one of the things Dave's talking about disruption and technologies on this, something to consider as far as the disruption goes. The disruption in blockchain is not about blockchain. The disruption in blockchain is driving reconsideration about the relationships between businesses. The technology is simply one potential realization of that. But the idea that we can interact peer-to-peer with businesses, with not just one, but with a collection of businesses across a community, that's really the disruption that a lot of people are driving towards. And my guess is the thing that's most likely. It's not the technology underlying it. It's the way we rethink the businesses and the relationship between our businesses that's likely to be the most critical change.
Great, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. There is a microphone somewhere. There it is. And here, please.
So this question is for Mick and even other panelists too. But I was intrigued by your comment about healthcare and some of the use cases there. And I come from a healthcare background. So I want to know your take on what are the pros and cons as blockchain and DLT applies to healthcare? Because as I see, there's a mad rush to find use cases. And let's use DLT, let's use blockchain for this. But I'm somewhat sobered by your comment, and I just want to get a perspective on that.
Just like, the financial services is clearly the first industry that has been feeling the disruption. They have invested a tremendous amount of money in pilots and proofs of concept to test out ideas on blockchain because they are first and foremost disrupted by, or felt the disruption by Bitcoin. The health industry is a very different beast. There is no fundamental disruption. There's none of the fear. It's an investigation of opportunity, of innovation in this space. The blockchain itself is not going to be useful for storing health records. It's just too inefficient as a sort of a core technology. But some of the work that's being done right now on using the chain as a means of, for example, providing auditability of exchange of records. That is, I'm doing an analytics computation on collections of genomic data that came from different sources, and I can attest to the fact that I have permission to use them and that I am using them appropriately according to government guidelines, for example. And being able to create public records
it's kind of a self-validating intellectual property
system. That's exactly right. Those are the ones. There was a recent article on DeepMind, which is a ABC, Google project. And it's very interesting because they're using, the article is interesting because they talk about blockchain, it's blockchain in the headlines, but in the article it says we're not using blockchain, we're not using decentralization. It's really just a replicated database. And by the way, that does point out to the fact that, that there are many, there are many different technologies inside this blockchain space. And if you look at something like GuardTime, which Estonia is using as essentially a notary service for public identifiers, all of these can play into providing new benefits and new services in the healthcare industry. And I think that's where a lot of the work is happening right now in that space.
Another question. There's one over here.
I read this week that IBM is offering blockchain as a service, but I haven't seen any use cases for that. Are you aware of any?
Go see him.
I work in IBM's Watson IoT group. I focus on blockchain, and I'm the engagement manager to actually work on many of the use cases that we're engaging with clients on. So we'll be talking afterwards.
Great.
The blockchain as a service is one of the projects. It's based on a Hyperledger Fabric, which is one of the projects in the Hyperledger group. So,
Please.
I guess David mentioned about blockchain being used in registry, land registry, and facilities. Do you see a use of blockchain in vehicle registry? I work for Toyota, so I'm asking this question.
I'm sorry, what kind of registry?
Vehicle.
Vehicle.
Vehicle. Yes, I have heard that. I don't focus on that area, but certainly, you know, the problem is somewhat similar, although we don't have to typically do title searches when we transfer a car ownership. The title is pretty well documented. I think the unique value, potentially, of blockchain for real estate title transfers is that difficulty of historical chains of ownership and clouds on titles, liens, and mortgages, and challenges to ownership based on inheritance, things like that. And you don't typically see that in vehicles.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think in vehicles there's a challenge where you sell, but the ownership is not transferred.
yes.
So the previous owner is on the hook. If there's any legal
If there's a
action.
lien.
That does
something,
make
yeah.
sense, yes.
Mark.
To kind of amplify a small thought here, which is at root, what the blockchain there's other things, but one thing it allows is a reduction in transaction costs, as people need to understand, as you're saying, who owns a vehicle or who doesn't. If we can get these transaction costs very small, we open up the opportunity for productive interaction in ways that are otherwise uneconomical. And a good example of that would be on two sides, I guess. Some of this is not necessarily connected. But one would be what I would call micro-lending. So you might have an asset, like a day's worth of a car, that you could lend against if it could be captured and held. Another would be the way in which we see very small types of consumer transactions where there's purchases and sales of what are nominal things. And we don't have them now because the costs are too big, even with Amazon and all that. So if we can look at the blockchain as not only a record system, but also a a mechanism to allow the transfer of physical property, then it opens up those kinds of possibilities.
And liability, right? If you have a car which you can
Yes.
rent by the day,
Yes.
and there is an accident while you're driving it.
It has to be clear.
You can attest to it.
Yeah.
In fact, and I'll even go another step farther, which is to say that it also exhibits one of the limiting factors. Let's assume that there were this ideal situation, and I let Bill have my car, and he used it, and something went wrong, not his fault, but I get accused, and I say, no, 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 it was very clear, and it fails. Where do I have recourse? Do I have the 17 nodes in the Ukraine that I go and try to foreclose against? So that's a difficult part of it, too. That's where I think the government will begin to standardize in ways that might facilitate.
Yeah. I'm afraid we're going to have to probably cut it off there because I've been given the signal a couple of times now. But we'll hang around as long as they let us here, and if not, we'll be out there. Let's thank the panelists very much, and thank you all for coming.